His Honour Deemster Doyle.
Good afternoon. My name is David Doyle. I'm Her Majesty's First Deemster and Clerk of the Rolls, the Chief Justice of this wonderful little island in the middle of the Irish Sea. But I appear before you this afternoon in my capacity as Deputy Governor. His Excellency is unable to attend, and I give apologies on his behalf. You are all very welcome here at Government House this afternoon, in particular Mr. Roger Ellison, Mrs. Ellison, and other members of the Ellison family. It's very good to see you all here this afternoon. It is my very great privilege and pleasure to be able to preside over this very special occasion today, which fittingly is being held on the 3rd day of September in the year 2014, designated Merchant Navy Day, as you're only too well aware, and the anniversary of the sinking of the SS Athena, the first British merchant vessel lost during the Second World War. And we are here today to undertake and to witness the formal presentation to Mr. Roger Ellison of the Arctic Star Medal and the Ushakov Medal. I have a lot of respect and admiration for what Mr. Ellison has achieved in his life, both during and after the Second World War. Some people think that a short journey across the Irish Sea in a Force 8 in a small passenger ferry is a challenge. Such challenge, if it can be called that, pales into total insignificance compared with the very real challenges that Mr. Ellison and his colleagues had to face during the Second World War. Churchill rightly acknowledged the challenges faced by the Arctic or Northern convoys as, and I quote, the worst journey in the world. In addition to the constant threat of enemy submarine, air and surface attacks, the men endured terrible weather conditions, the darkness of the polar winter, and 24-hour daylight at the height of the summer. They had to deal with severe cold, with storms, with fog, with ice floes, and with waves so huge they tore at the ship's armour plating. If ships were sunk, and many of them sadly were, sailors perished in water barely above freezing. The medals I'm about to formally present to Mr. Ellison are very well-deserved medals, and I'm pleased that recognition is now being given to all those veterans who served in the harsh conditions of the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans during the Second World War. I will now formally present the medals.
Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you. I would like to thank Your Honour for your kind words. I feel very privileged to be here with my family on this beautiful island and have you giving me a medal, something which I never ever thought about when I was a young man of 17 going away in the Merchant Navy in 1943. A more lowly position you couldn't have really than junior ordinary seaman. And but it's been left to me to say a few words about the Merchant Navy, which I feel honour bound to do, because in 2 world wars the Merchant Navy was the lifeline between Britain starving and Britain living and fighting on. And it must never be forgotten that there were actually more merchant ships sunk in the First World War than the Second. But the Second World War, there was a loss of far greater tonnage, 14 million tons, and there were 2,800 merchant ships lost over the years of the war, which is just an incredible amount of death and destruction. As we're here being presented, or I've been presented with the Arctic Star and Ushakov medal, if I can just say a few words about the people who are in the Arctic convoys that I have researched and know about. The life that was that they had aboard the ships. They were all volunteers. They were just told, there's your ship, take the cargo and off you go, which they did do. But one of the first convoys, which I'd like to mention, and I won't go on for hours and hours, I'm not an MHK, I won't ramble, but I'd just like to say that a flavour of what went on was the convoy that started off in Iceland, taking stores to Murmansk and Archangel, which was known as the PQ-17. Now this convoy went in July 1942, when there was so much daylight. And unfortunately, the Admiralty received words that the Tirpitz, which was the sister ship of the Bismarck, had sailed out of a Norwegian port, and they were feared that it would get to this convoy and attack it, and it would of course destroy it. And they ordered the naval ships to stand back and the convoy to scatter. This was the first time any convoy had ever been told to scatter, not by someone in charge actually with the convoy, but this was Sir Dudley Pound in the Admiralty. He based this solely on the fact that he thought the Tirpitz was coming out. Well, the result of this was that 14 ships were sunk in one single day by U-boats and by aerial bombardment, and 100,000 tons of supplies were lost. Just extraordinary, because the amount of tonnage that was taken to Russia in these convoys amounted to 4 million tons of supplies that went to Russia to help fight Germany. So after this terrible loss of life, the Admiralty said, well, I think it's far better that convoys should really go, and there were American ships and there were Canadian ships lost in this terrible convoy. Far better if ships went in the winter time, when we had far more darkness, and the ships could get nearer the polar ice cap and get some shelter. Of course, this meant that they had to sail in far colder waters and suffer far more for the lookouts and for the navigators than they would going in the summer. But this was the decision that was made, and I think it was quite right. The number of ships that were lost on these Russian convoys totaled about 128 ships, and including 15 naval vessels. So there were some terrible, sad stories to be told about all these convoys going to Russia. I will fast forward, if I may, to my experience, which is just as an observer, nothing to do with the heroism that these people that were on these terrible Arctic convoys through the winter time, who some of them made several trips. These were the true heroes, and I'm so proud to be able to talk about it to people and remind them what the Merchant Navy did in the past and is still doing now, because 95% of everything that comes in and out of Great Britain goes via ships. Well, one day, having been on the Scythia then, which was an armed troop ship, armed for protection only, I had travelled round Atlantic convoys, half a dozen of those, and many convoys through the Mediterranean and even out through the Suez Canal to India. So I'd been travelling on the Scythia for a year when finally we came to Prince's landing stage on my 18th birthday, and we found that we were loading Russians on board, and there were thousands of Russians coming from Riverside Station, and these people had been released by the British and American armies attacking the German armies, and they were releasing these Russians. Some had been in labour camps, some had been maybe fighting with the Germans against the British forces. Anyway, they decided to send us up 2 troop ships to go to Murmansk. Well, troop ships are very, very vulnerable. A torpedoed troop ship is a huge loss of life. The Scythia, which I was on, her sister ship, the Laconia, she was sunk off Africa in about the 1940-41 with a loss of nearly 4,000 lives. So to send 2 troop ships up in these dangerous waters was rather extraordinary. But they wanted to get these thousands of Russians back to Murmansk. The escorts that we had were absolutely massive to take this, because they were obviously aware, Admiralty, of the danger of having one of these ships sunk, torpedoed. And one of the escorts was HMS Belfast, which of course is moored in the Thames, and another was an aircraft carrier. But there were so many escorts. We went up to Iceland, where many of the convoys started. We took a northerly course as close to the polar ice as you could, and went round. This was we then sailed on the 31st of October. Well, we had, unfortunately for the navigators and the lookouts, very severe weather, which helped protect us, but made life rather unpleasant for everyone on board the ships. But eventually we got to Murmansk, which was down quite a long river, and no one was allowed ashore. We just anchored off there, and we started discharging all these poor Russians who had been on board, who were very badly dressed and just had any gear that they could get hold of, I suppose. And it was the thought of the Tirpitz coming out that really worried the Admiralty. And on the 30th of October, before we sailed, they had sent Lancaster bombers up to Tromsø, where the Tirpitz was moored, to try and sink it then. But they failed because they had huge smoke screens and heavy anti-aircraft fire there, and they failed to do it. So she was still there. But anyway, we stayed in Murmansk for three days, discharging all these Russians, and then about the 11th we sailed to go back to the UK. Well, if I may say that 27 Lancasters came from Scotland and bombed the Tirpitz with tall boy bombs, the biggest bombs that were made those days. They had to lighten the Lancaster to be able to take them. And in the end, these bombs did their work, and the Tirpitz, this wonderful ship, which had caused so much trouble of people thinking she was coming out and what she could do, but never did come out. But eventually it was sunk. It turned turtle when a magazine exploded, and there was a big loss of life for the poor Germans. So about 1,000 died, but that's war, isn't it? Terribly sad. So anyway, we eventually had more bad weather, but we got back to Liverpool in the end. So my story is a story of an Arctic convoy, but nothing like the ones that the majority of people suffered over the years. And but I felt I must tell the story as little of it I know, and say to people, never forget the Merchant Navy. It's, when they talk about the armed services, please and say, and also the Merchant Marine. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I've managed to get through this
Well done.
Yeah.
fairly well.
Well, you have a set of notes as well.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Oh no, I don't need notes.
It's all in your head.
There's enough scrambled egg up here. But I would like to finish, if I may, because at the age of 88, next October, I feel mortality, but I also think about how things have been over life, and you wonder about life and talk about it. And if I may just quote a little Shakespeare as I finish, and say Macbeth, when he was told of the death of Lady Macbeth, said, "Out, out, brief candle, life is but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then it's no more." Now, the next few words are, "It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, and signifying nothing." Thank you again, Your Honour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.